We're now on Daf Yud Aleph Amid Beis. Omer lo Rabbi Yeshua. Matzinu Mosar Chatas Ba'ola. So you designated a carbon for Chatas. It got lost. You brought a substitute. Now you found the original one. That's called Mosar Chatas. And you could bring it as a carbon Ola. And that's derived by the Gemara in Tmur on Daf Chaf Gimel Amid Beis. And normally you would have said that, a Mosar Chata should be should die because of the halacha Moshe Misina v'chatas shemesa. But in this case, let's say he designated a certain amount of money to buy a carbon chatas, and the animal, let's say, was bought for less than that amount, so he had a surplus, and that money is going to be used to buy an ola. Or let's say there are two animals that are designated for a chatas, and he has a backup chatas, and he brings the first one, and now he's left with the backup one, and that surplus animal has halacha of yira achi stoyev. The ain mosar ola b'chatos, but you cannot bring a mosar ola again in those situations, and surplus money from the purchase of an ola cannot be used to buy a chatos. You could buy another ola, but not a chatos. Right? In the case of a chatos, we said that a mosar chatos could be brought as an ola, and nevertheless, shchatos l'shem ola psula, if he shechts it for the purpose of an ola, it's possible. Is ola she'ein mosar bo chatos, is shchato l'shem chatos einu din shete psula, and therefore, this argument of Rabbi Yoshua leads to the conclusion that if you shechted a carbon ola l'shem chatas, it certainly should be psula. And Rabbi Eliezer doesn't argue against this argument. Apparently, he accepted this argument as a very difficult question and objection, and therefore, Rabbah is going to come to the conclusion, as we saw in Omen Aleph, that according to Rabbi Eliezer, if a carbon was shechted for the sake of a chatas, it's going to be kshera, it's going to be kosher, because even though a carbon that was shechted for the sake of a pesach is possible, not a carbon that's shechted for the sake of a chatas. Omar lo Rabbi Eliezer. So now the Brisa has to quote some sort of response of Rabbi Eliezer because the logical argument of Rabbi Yeshua was accepted. Lo, if you have the case of an ola that was shechted for the sake of a chatos, shekeg sher lishma kol hashana kula, and the reason for this is because a chatos would be kosher if it was shechted lishma during the entire year. Tomar bepesach she'eno kosher lishma bismano. Can you compare that to the case of a pesach, which is only kosher if it's shechted lishma on the 14th of Nisan bismano, holvu posel lishmo, and therefore it becomes posel if it's shechted for its own sake during the rest of the year. Dinushi posel achem lishma makes sense that other karbanos that are brought l'shem Pesach should also be posel. Okay, now we get to the last part of our Mishnah, which presents the Bar Plukta, the Tanakama, that Shimon Achi Azariah, who says that if a carbon is shechted for a gavoa mimenu, then it's kosher. But if it's shechted for nomoch mimenu, less of a sanctity, is possible. So Rav Ashi Masni Mishmei de Rabbi Yochanan, Rav Acha Berei de Rav Masni Mishmei de Rabbi Yanai, my time of the Shimon Achi Azariah, the Omar Kroa v'lo yechalu es kodshe b'nei Yisrael, Esa sheyorimu Hashem. And he's learning this as a reference to karbonos. So when it says Yarimu, it means that you brought it one notch higher, gavoa. So beruma mehem ein nischalin. If the carbon was brought for the sake of a carbon that's greater in its kedusha, then it's not possible. But namach mehem, however, if he shechted it for the purpose of another carbon that's on a lower level, namach mehem is mischalin, then the carbon is possible. So Gemara says, I don't get it. This pasuk is not even referring to karbonos. Hai lahachi udiyosav iboyle l'shmuel. I need it for the case of what's called tevel. Diyomer shmuel minayin li ochel tevel shu b'misa. How do we know that the punishment for eating tevel is misa v'dei shamayim? Shenemar, because the Torah says lo yichalu es kodesh b'nei Yisrael eisa sheyarimu l'Hashem. Now, Eisa Sheyarimu in the Lashon Asid in the future is referring to Tevel, where in the future there'll be Mafresh, and Basidim Litro Makosim Medaber, and the Torah compares it to Chilul Kodshe B'nei Yisrael. So we're talking about food that's in the state of Tevel, and when it says Lo Yechalu, the inference is that it's forbidden to eat the produce as long as it's truma, which is yorimu, that's the kodesh part, has not been separated, has not been taken away. And the Gemara in Masechta Sanhedrin on Daf Pei Gimel goes on to tell you, how do you know that he's chayav misa b'dei shamayim for partaking of tevel? And that's based on Gzeir Shava of Yechalalu, which refers also to a portion in the Torah of a Tomei who eats Truma, and a Tomei who eats Truma is Chayav Mitzvah B'dei Shamayim, so too anyone who eats Tevel is Chayav Mitzvah B'dei Shamayim. So the Gemara says, Im Kain, Lichtov Krasher Hurmu, Maya Sher Yorimu Shmami Notar. We can derive two things from the same pasuk. One conclusion with regard to Shalol Lishma and Kodshim, and that's because it says Asher Yorimu, and then it says Asher Hurmu. That makes sense, but Yorimu in the future tense, that's referring to Tevel. Shmami Notartu, we can derive both halachos. Boy Rab Zera, Ksherin V'ein Meratzin. What do we say according to Shimon ben Achi Azariah when he says that if you shecht a carbon to a gavoa mimenu, then it's kosher? Does he mean that the Bailam have fulfilled their chiyuv? They have ritzui carbon? And if that be the case, then kipolig b'chadapod, the machlokes between Shimon and the Chacham, the Tanakama, is limited to one issue. And that is whether or not a carbon that was brought shalol lishma, but if it was brought for a namuch, a lower sanctity, then according to Shimon Achi Azar, it's possible. According to Rabban, it's kosher. But even according to this tzad in the Gemara Safek, even Shimon Achi Azar would concede that although, let's say, the carbon, if it's l'gavoa mimenu, is kosher, he's not going to go as far as to say that I disagree with the Chacham and I upgrade it to the state of ritzui, or dilma ksherim muratzim. Maybe in the case of l'gavoa mihem, where Shimon ben Azariah holds that the carbon is kosher, maybe he went even a step further and said that it is maratza. Then we have a double machlokas. So number one, if a carbon was shechted for the sake of a greater sanctity, according to the Tanakama, it's valid, but it's not maratza. Eino olu l'shem chov. According to Shimon in this side, Shimon disagrees even in the case of Gavomen because he says it's maratza. If on the other hand the carbon was shechted for the sake of a namuch shebahem, then according to Tanakam it's valid, and according to Shimon Achiyazar is totally invalid. That's a double machlok. Somra by vitem Rab Zrika. Toshma, maybe we can get an answer to your question from the examples that Shimon Achiyazari gives for his principle. In the Mishnah back on Daf Beis. Habachor Maseches sheshchoton l'shem shlomim ksherim, so that's gavosh shalahem. But on the other hand, in the reverse, shlomim sheshchoton l'shem bechor or l'shem maser psul, because that's namuch shebahem. Be'isal kedata ksherim umeratzin, if in the case of gavosh shalahem, Shimon Achiyazari holds that it's even meratza. Is Bechor bar Ritzuyehu? I don't get it. Why quote the example of Bechor? Bechor has nothing to do with Ritzui Karban. Simply it's a Chovas Kodshim of Bechor. Ella what? Therefore, we have to conclude that Ksherim V'yena Meratzin and be the Sefer Ksherim Meratzin, right? In the case of the Sefer, where it's kosher and it's not meratzim, meaning it's l'gavah shalahem, is reisha namik ksherim v'ena meratzim. So too in the reisha, we should come to the same conclusion that it's ksherim but ena meratzim. So therefore, Shimon Achiyazari gave an example of kodshim kalim that were brought for the sake of kodshe kodshim, that's gavah shalahem. Then he gives a second example that the Bechar and the Maser that's for sure no Ritzui, so he must mean the same thing in the first case, that if Kodshim Kal were brought for the sake of Kodshi Kodshim, then it doesn't provide any sort of Ritzui. So the Gemara answers, Midei Irya, is that really a proof? Hakid Isa, Hakid Isa. The example of Bechar or Maser is on its own. There's no ritzui, but maybe in the case of a carbon, let's say a carbon kodshim kalim that was brought l'shem kodshim kodshim, there maybe it would even be maratza elikom haikom mashmalon. So why indeed does Shimon Achiyazari have to give me the case of a bechar or maser? Why isn't it sufficient? Right, a Bechar Maser that were brought l'shem shlomim. Why isn't it sufficient just to give me the example of kodshi kodshim l'shem kodshim kalim? Kodshim kalim l'shem kodshi kodshim. So the Gemara answers gavo v'nomach kamashmo. Are you telling me that he wants to give an example of gavo and nomuch t'nina? That's not a valid answer because we already have it in our Mishnah, Ketzah, Kodshi Kodshim, Shchot Hashem Kodshim Kalim. And the reverse, Kodshi Kodshim, Kodshi Kal, Hashem Kodshi Kodshim. So we have already examples of Nomuch and Gavo. Why did Shimon have to give another example of Bechar Mas? And the Gemara answers, Ma'u D'Tema Kodshim Kodshim Kalim, Hu De'ik Gavo V'Nomuch. Because it's all within the realm of Kodshi Kodshim Kalim going up to Kodshi Kodshim, or going down from Kodshi Kodshim to Kodshim Kalim, Aval Kalim Kalim. But if both types of karbonos are Kalim, meaning they're not Kodshi Kodshim, but Kodshim Kalim, then perhaps we would think that in such a case, maybe there is no such thing as Nomuch Shevulahem. And therefore, Kamash Malon, Shimon has to teach me the second example of Bechar or Maser that was shechted for the sake of Shlomim to show that even within Kodshim Kalim, there's Nomuch and there's Gavod, the different levels of Kedusha. Gemara doesn't like that either. Hanami Tanina, we have it in a Mishnah on Daf Pei Tes. It says, Shlomim Kodmim Es Bechar. Let's say you have two korbanos to bring. One is Shlomim, the other is Bechar. Which comes first? Shlomim comes first, takes precedence, priority. B'nei Shem Terunim Arba Matan Arba and Smich and Nisach and Teruvas Kodesh Shok. whereas all this is not applicable to Bechor. Anyway, we see clearly that there's a hierarchy even within Kodshim Kalim between Shlomim and Bechor. So what does Shimon have to tell us? Ha'ikar hahi agrora naspa. The Mishnah of Shimon is the primary source teaching us this hierarchy. That Mishnah later on in Peites is agrora naspa. It's mentioned only incidentally. So the Mishnah below, which discusses the hierarchy of all types of sacrifices, includes the cases of Bechor and Shlomim, incidentally, though it could certainly be derived from our Mishnah. This leads us to the Mishnah here, Adaf Yud Aleph Amid Beis.